close your eyes. Let the weight of the day drift away. Tonight, we journey through the gilded corridors and shadowed archives of one of the world's most scrutinized yet secretive institutions. For centuries, the British royal family has been both spectacle and mystery, their lives unfolding in public while their deepest truths remained locked behind palace walls. This is a story of crowns and concealment, of duty and deception, of moments when the carefully constructed image cracked to reveal something far more human and far more troubling beneath. Before we start, I'd be so grateful if you would subscribe to my channel if you like the videos I am making for you. It's totally free, and it will help ensure you don't miss the new sleep videos I post a few times a week. I'd also to hear from you. Where in the world are you? And what time is it where you are right now? Okay, let's begin our video. What you're about to hear spans more than a century of secrets. Some were buried intentionally, calculated suppressions designed to protect the throne. Others emerged slowly, reluctantly, forced into light by circumstance or scandal. Together, they paint a picture not just of a family, but of an entire system built on the careful management of truth. Let the words wash over you as we begin at the beginning, in the aftermath of a world war that changed everything, including what it meant to be royal. The British monarchy, as we know it today, was forged in crisis. Before the 20th century, it had been an institution of vast power, its members ruling with divine right, their word law. But the modern era brought challenges the old ways couldn't answer. Democracy spread, empires crumbled. The Great War showed that even emperors could fall, that revolution could sweep away the most ancient thrones. In this new world, the British monarchy would have to adapt or perish. And adaptation, it turned out, meant becoming masters of public relations, of image management, of carefully controlling what the public could see and know. The 100 secrets and scandals we're about to explore are not isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern, a way of operating that was established over a century ago and continues to this day. Each scandal reveals something about how power protects itself. Each secret, when finally uncovered, shows us the gap between the image and the reality, between what the institution wants us to believe and what actually happened. As you listen, you'll hear echoes and repetitions, the same strategies deployed across generations, the same instincts for concealment, the same willingness to sacrifice truth for survival. This is not a story with villains and heroes, though there are certainly those who behaved badly and those who suffered unjustly. It's a story about an institution, about how systems perpetuate themselves, about the mechanisms of power and secrecy. The royals themselves are both agents and victims of this system, trapped by the very structures meant to elevate them, forced to play roles that often deny their humanity. Some have chafed against these constraints, others have embraced them, but all have been shaped by them. So settle in. Let your mind drift as the story unfolds. These are tales meant for the quiet hours, for that space between waking and sleep where truth and history blend together. Over the next 3 hours, we'll travel from the battlefields of World War I to the tabloid wars of the 21st century. We'll meet kings and princes, princesses and duchesses, courtiers and conspirators. We'll witness moments of genuine tragedy and moments of calculated manipulation. And through it all, we'll ask, what does it mean to be royal? What is the cost of the crown? And who pays that cost? Let's start. In the spring of 1917, as the Great War raged across Europe and empires crumbled into dust, the British monarchy faced a crisis of identity. For generations, they had been the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a name that spoke openly of their German heritage. But now, with Britain locked in brutal combat against Germany, that very name had become a liability. Anti-German sentiment ran so deep that even Dachshunds were kicked in the streets. The royal family, whose bloodlines wove through every European court, found themselves uncomfortably foreign in the nation they were meant to embody. King George V understood what needed to be done. In a stroke of calculated reinvention, he issued a proclamation. The royal house would henceforth be known as Windsor, named after the ancient castle that had stood for nearly a millennium. It was a masterstroke of public relations, wrapping the monarchy in the cloak of English antiquity and obscuring those inconvenient German roots. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, reportedly joked that he looked forward to seeing Shakespeare's play, The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. But the joke fell flat. The rebranding worked. The House of Windsor sounded thoroughly, reassuringly British. It was perhaps the first great lesson in modern royal image management. When truth becomes uncomfortable, change the story. But there were deeper secrets in those war years, secrets that cut closer to the heart. In distant Russia, another cousin, another royal family, found themselves trapped in revolution. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children had been overthrown, imprisoned, their fate growing darker by the day. George V had known Nicholas since childhood. They looked so alike they could have been twins. And now Nicholas was pleading for help, for asylum, for a chance to escape the gathering storm. The British government initially agreed to offer sanctuary. Plans were drawn up. But as the political winds shifted and public opinion hardened against the Russians, George V grew anxious. Granting asylum to the deposed Tsar might destabilize his own throne, might associate him too closely with autocracy at a moment when democracy was the watchword. In private cables kept from public view for decades afterward, the king expressed his reservations. The offer of asylum quietly evaporated. Nicholas and his family remained trapped. Within months, they would be murdered in a basement in Ekaterinburg, their bodies thrown down a mineshaft. For years afterward, the full extent of British reluctance remained hidden. Official histories were sanitized. The private correspondence that revealed the king's fears and calculations stayed locked in royal archives. When the truth finally emerged, historians would debate whether George V's caution contributed to the Romanov family's fate. Could he have done more? Should he have? The answers remain contested, but the pattern was set. Difficult truths could be managed, contained, kept from the public eye for generations if necessary. The dignity of the crown demanded nothing less. This instinct for concealment would become institutional. In the years following the war, as the monarchy navigated the strange new landscape of the 20th century, other secrets accumulated. Private correspondence of early 20th century royals was destroyed or withheld. When members of the royal family died, their wills, documents that might reveal uncomfortable details about wealth or personal arrangements, were sealed away. Unlike ordinary citizens, whose wills became public record, royals could hide these final testaments, citing the dignity of the crown as justification. There was no statutory basis for this practice. It simply became tradition, another layer of privacy, another wall between the institution and scrutiny. The media, too, learned to play its part. In the early decades of the 20th century, British newspapers practiced a kind of self-censorship when it came to royal marital troubles or sexual indiscretions. It wasn't that journalists didn't know. Rumours circulated in Fleet Street newsrooms and society drawing rooms. but publishing such material was considered beyond the pale, a violation of an unspoken compact. The royals were meant to embody a certain ideal, and the press, by and large, protected that ideal. The phrase, "the dignity of the crown," became a kind of talisman, invoked whenever questions grew too pointed or curiosity too keen. Archives that might have illuminated these early years remained restricted. Files touching on politically sensitive matters involving the royal family were sealed for extended periods, their contents known only to a handful of officials. The institutional memory of the monarchy was carefully curated, pruned of anything that might tarnish the image of continuity and stability. From the very beginning, as that opening line reminds us, survival depended not on honesty, but on control. Control of information, control of narrative, control of how the public understood the strange, anachronistic institution at the heart of British life. And so the pattern was established, the foundation laid. The crown would present one face to the world while guarding its private truths jealously. It was a system that would endure for decades, adapting as needed, but never truly changing. The secrets would pile up, layer upon layer, waiting for moments of crisis or curiosity to pry them loose. We're only at the beginning of this journey. There are many more secrets to come, many more moments when the carefully maintained facade would crack. But first, we must meet the man whose choices would test the entire system in ways no one could have imagined. In January 1936, King George V died, and his eldest son ascended to the throne as Edward VIII. The new king was handsome, charming, and modern. He seemed perfectly suited to lead the monarchy into a new era. But Edward carried with him a complication, a secret that would, within months, precipitate the greatest constitutional crisis of the 20th century. Her name was Wallis Simpson. She was American, twice divorced, and still married to her second husband when she and Edward fell in love. By the standards of the time, and especially by the standards of the Church of England, of which the king was supreme governor, this relationship was scandalous. Divorce carried profound stigma. A divorced woman, particularly one whose first husband was still living, could not be considered a suitable consort for the British monarch. The establishment, the church, the government all united in opposition. For months, the affair was an open secret in high society, but largely unknown to the British public. The press, exercising that familiar restraint, said nothing. But Edward was determined. He loved Wallis and wanted to marry her, to make her his queen. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, made clear this was impossible. The king could not marry a divorced woman and retain his throne. A choice would have to be made. In December 1936, less than a year after he became king, Edward made his decision. In a radio broadcast that stunned the nation, he announced his abdication. He spoke of finding it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman he loved. It was framed as romantic sacrifice, a king giving up his throne for love. The narrative was carefully managed. Edward became the Duke of Windsor, and he and Wallis married the following year in France. But there were other dimensions to this story, dimensions that would only fully emerge decades later. Edward's political sympathies were troubling. As the 1930s progressed and Nazi Germany grew ever more aggressive, Edward displayed a distressing affinity for fascist ideology. He admired authoritarian efficiency. He made remarks that suggested sympathy with Hitler's regime. These were not idle comments. They reflected a genuine alignment, a belief that perhaps the Nazis weren't so bad, that perhaps their methods had merit. In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor visited Germany. It was an official tour, complete with photo opportunities. They met with senior Nazi figures, including Hitler himself. Photographs captured them smiling, chatting, the Duke giving what looked very much like a Nazi salute. The optics were disastrous, though at the time much of this was downplayed or suppressed in the British press. The palace and government exerted pressure to keep coverage minimal, to avoid drawing attention to the embarrassing spectacle of the former king, cavorting with the enemy. During World War II, concerns about Edward's loyalties intensified. He was appointed governor of the Bahamas, a position many saw as a gilded exile, getting him as far from Europe as possible to prevent any mischief. But after the war, when Allied forces captured German archives, they discovered the so-called Marburg Files. These documents contained correspondence suggesting the Nazis had hoped to use Edward, perhaps even to install him as a puppet king if Britain were defeated. The details were murky, and Edward denied any treasonous intent, but the files were damning enough that the British government moved swiftly to retrieve and control them. For decades, files related to the Duke of Windsor's wartime activities and Nazi connections remained sealed. Official histories treated the matter delicately. The full scope of Edward's indiscretions, his flirtation with fascism, his potential vulnerability to German manipulation, these remained murky, known in outline, but not in detail. The sealing of these files was another exercise in institutional self-protection. The monarchy had survived Edward's abdication, but it could not afford for him to be remembered as a Nazi sympathizer or potential traitor. Better to let time pass, let memories fade, let the romantic narrative of the king who gave up everything for love obscure the uglier truths. The abdication crisis, as it became known, exposed the fragility of the monarchy's carefully constructed image. It showed that personal choices could have constitutional consequences, that the desires of an individual king could collide catastrophically with the demands of the institution. Edward's abdication forced his younger brother, George VI, onto the throne, a man who had never expected or wanted to be king, who struggled with a stammer and lacked his brother's natural charisma. But George VI would prove steadier, more dutiful. He and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, would shepherd the monarchy through the Second World War, restoring stability and dignity. The crown survived, but the truth of Edward's story, the full truth, did not. It remained locked away, parceled out slowly over decades, a cautionary tale of what happens when a royal steps too far outside the bounds of what the system can tolerate. George VI ruled for 15 years, guiding Britain through war and into an uncertain peace. But like his father before him, he would not live to see old age. In the early 1950s, the king fell seriously ill. He had lung cancer, a consequence of years of heavy smoking. But in keeping with that familiar instinct for concealment, there was limited public disclosure about the severity of his condition. The palace issued reassuring bulletins. The king was resting. He was recuperating. The public was kept at a comfortable distance from the reality that their monarch was dying. This pattern of managing information about royal health would recur throughout the decades. It wasn't just about sparing the king's dignity or privacy. It was about managing public anxiety, about maintaining the illusion of continuity and stability. If the monarch was unwell, truly unwell, it suggested vulnerability, mortality, the uncomfortable truth that the crown passed from one fallible human to another. Better to smooth over the details, to let the nation hold on to hope until the very end. But there were other silences in these years, silences that would later provoke outrage and moral reckoning. Hidden away from public view, institutionalized in facilities where they would never be seen or spoken of, were two of the king's nieces. Catherine and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, daughters of the Queen's brother, were born with severe developmental disabilities. In an era when such conditions carried profound stigma, when families often hid disabled relatives away, the Bowes-Lyon family made a choice. The girls were quietly placed in an institution. Officially, they were recorded as dead in Burke's Peerage. For decades, they lived in obscurity, their existence unknown to the public, rarely visited even by family. When the truth finally emerged in the 1980s, the revelation sparked widespread condemnation. How could the royal family have hidden away these vulnerable young women? How could they have erased them so thoroughly from the public record? The explanations offered: that it was a different time, that attitudes toward disability were less enlightened, rang hollow. What it revealed was the same instinct we've seen again and again. Anything that complicated the pristine image of the royal family, anything that suggested imperfection or difficulty, could be made to disappear. Out of sight, out of mind, and eventually out of history. While the royal family managed these private shames, they also contended with the public behavior of its members. Prince Philip, who married Princess Elizabeth in 1947, just before she became queen, was a complicated figure. Handsome, dynamic, and often abrasive, he brought energy to the monarchy, but also persistent rumors. Throughout their long marriage, there were whispers about Philip's fidelity, suggestions of affairs, of indiscretions. These rumors never fully went away. They circulated in the press, were alluded to in biographies, surfaced in moments of royal crisis, but they were never definitively proven, and the palace never dignified them with official comment. Philip was also known for his gaffes, his racially insensitive and sexist remarks. He seemed to relish provocation, making comments that would make palace aides wince. To Indigenous Australians, to Chinese students, to countless others, Philip delivered remarks that ranged from thoughtless to offensive. The official line was always that these were simply gaffes, harmless bits of politically incorrect humor from a man of a different generation. The press, for the most part, treated them that way, as colorful quirks rather than serious failings. There was a restraint around Philip's private life too, a sense that certain lines would not be crossed, certain questions would not be pursued too aggressively. This tight press management around the private lives of senior royals extended to nearly everyone in the family. The palace had learned over decades how to manage the media, how to feed stories that served the institution's interests, while starving attention from anything problematic. It was a delicate dance, a constant negotiation between the public's fascination with the royals and the palace's determination to control the narrative. Most of the time, it worked, but the system had weaknesses. It depended on cooperation, on journalists and editors who still felt some allegiance to the old compact, some sense that certain things simply weren't done. As the century wore on, that compact would fray. New generations of reporters, new tabloid appetites, would test the boundaries. And when the system faced a genuine crisis, when a member of the family refused to play by the rules, the carefully maintained control would shatter spectacularly. Princess Margaret, the Queen's younger sister, was beautiful, vivacious, and deeply romantic. In the early 1950s, she fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated war hero who served as an equerry to the royal household. It should have been a perfect match, but there was a problem. Townshend was divorced. His former wife was still alive. Once again, the same obstacle that had brought down Edward VIII loomed large. The Church of England could not countenance the marriage. The establishment united in opposition. For years, Margaret and Townshend endured a kind of romantic limbo. They loved each other, but the path to marriage seemed impossible. Political and religious pressure mounted. Margaret was told she could marry Townshend, but only if she renounced her royal titles and her place in the line of succession. It was an agonizing choice. In 1955, after much soul-searching, Margaret issued a statement. She had decided not to marry Townshend. The world's heart broke for her. The story had captivated the public, a real-life fairy tale with a tragic ending. The decision haunted Margaret. She never quite recovered from the loss of that great love. In 1960, she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a photographer who seemed bohemian and exciting. They had 2 children, but the marriage was turbulent from the start. There were affairs on both sides. Armstrong Jones had relationships outside the marriage. So did Margaret. The press began to cover Margaret's excesses, her late nights at parties, her indulgences. She was portrayed as a tragic figure, a princess trapped by duty, seeking solace in pleasure and distraction. In 1978, Margaret and Armstrong Jones divorced. It was the first divorce of a senior royal in modern times, a crack in the myth of royal permanence. The monarchy had always presented marriage as sacred and enduring. Royals were supposed to embody stability. But here was the Queen's own sister, divorced, her private life a mess, unable to hide her unhappiness despite all the privileges of her position. The institution weathered the scandal, but it was another sign that the old rules, the old assumptions, were breaking down. Margaret's story is a reminder that tradition, while meant to protect the institution, often came at a terrible human cost. She had been denied the chance to marry the man she loved because of rules that seemed increasingly arbitrary and cruel. Her subsequent unhappiness, her failed marriage, her public struggles, all of it traced back to that initial denial. The monarchy had preserved its dignity, its adherence to doctrine, but at what price? Margaret spent the rest of her life in the shadow of what might have been a cautionary tale of duty triumphing over desire, and the bitterness that followed. In the shadows of the royal family moved figures whose influence extended far beyond their public roles. One such figure was Lord Louis Mountbatten, uncle to Prince Philip, and a man of immense ambition and charm. Mountbatten had been the last Viceroy of India, overseeing its partition and independence. He was a war hero, a statesman, a man who moved easily in the higher circles of power. But he was also a man with secrets. Throughout his life, rumors swirled about Mountbatten's private life, about his sexuality and his relationships. These rumors were never confirmed, never openly discussed, but they existed, whispered in the same breath as speculation about his political ambitions. Mountbatten was known to harbour grandiose visions for the monarchy and for his own role within it. He dreamed of his family, the Mountbattens, being more prominently associated with the crown. When Philip married Elizabeth, there had been tension over whether the royal house would take Philip's name. In the end, it remained Windsor, a decision that reportedly disappointed Mountbatten. But the most troubling rumours about Mountbatten involved politics, specifically the suggestion that in the 1960s and 70s, during periods of political and economic turmoil in Britain, he was involved in discussions about a possible coup. The idea seems almost fantastical. A coup in Britain. But there were whispers, documented in the memoirs of intelligence officials and journalists, of conversations among military and establishment figures about what might be done if the Labour government went too far to the left, if the country descended into chaos. Mountbatten's name came up in these discussions. The notion that someone of his stature and military background might lend legitimacy to some kind of emergency government. How serious were these conversations? It's hard to say. Decades passed before historians and journalists began to explore these allegations in depth. Government anxiety about potential plots, about Mountbatten's outsized influence, was real. But whether anything concrete was ever planned, whether Mountbatten himself took the idea seriously, remains murky. Files that might illuminate the truth remained classified for years, subject to the same restrictions that kept so many other royal and establishment secrets hidden. When details did finally emerge, they painted a picture of an establishment willing to contemplate undemocratic actions to preserve its vision of order, with Mountbatten at least entertaining the notion of playing a role. Mountbatten's life ended violently in 1979 when he was assassinated by the IRA in a bomb attack while on his boat off the coast of Ireland. His death was a profound shock, but even in death, the full scope of his ambitions and machinations remained partially obscured. The monarchy had benefited from his service, but it had also been wary of his appetites for power and influence. He was a reminder that even within the royal orbit, there were individuals whose private agendas and hidden lives complicated the institution's carefully managed image. The secrets didn't belong only to the royals themselves, but to those who moved in their circles, wielding influence, harboring ambitions, and leaving behind questions that would take decades to even partially answer. Charles Philip Arthur George, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne, grew up in a world of unimaginable privilege and crushing expectation. From the moment of his birth, his life was not his own. He was the future king, raised to embody duty, continuity, tradition. But beneath the surface, Charles was a sensitive, introspective man, interested in architecture, art, and philosophy, often at odds with the rigid formality of his role. And he was in love with someone he could not have. Her name was Camilla Shand, later Camilla Parker Bowles. Charles met her in the early 1970s, and they formed a deep connection. But Camilla was not considered suitable for a future king. She lacked the aristocratic pedigree, the pristine background that the establishment demanded. While Charles dithered, uncertain and constrained by protocol, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. Charles, heartbroken, eventually moved on, but he never truly let go of his feelings for Camilla. In the late 1970s, pressure mounted on Charles to marry. He was in his 30s, and the succession needed to be secured. The palace and the establishment began searching for a suitable bride. She needed to be young, aristocratic, virginal, and photogenic. They found Lady Diana Spencer, a 19-year-old kindergarten teacher from a noble family. Diana was beautiful, shy, and seemed perfect for the role. Charles, emotionally distant and still entangled with Camilla, agreed to the match. It was a dynastic arrangement, prioritizing compatibility with the institution over compatibility with each other. The wedding in July 1981 was a global spectacle. Millions watched as Charles and Diana exchanged vows in St. Paul's Cathedral. It was framed as a fairy tale, a union that would revitalize the monarchy. But those close to the couple knew the truth. Even before the wedding, there were serious incompatibilities. Charles was older, set in his ways, emotionally reserved. Diana was young, romantic, desperate for affection, and looming over everything was Camilla. Charles had never truly ended his emotional involvement with her. Even as he prepared to marry Diana, his heart was elsewhere. Diana sensed this from the beginning. She later recounted finding a bracelet Charles had commissioned for Camilla, discovering that he was in contact with his old flame, feeling the cold distance between them even on their honeymoon. But the public saw none of this. They saw the smiling couple, the beautiful princess, the handsome prince. The palace's image machine worked overtime to sell the fairy tale. For a while, it succeeded. Diana became the most photographed woman in the world. Her every outfit, her every appearance was analyzed and celebrated. The monarchy seemed vibrant and modern again, embodied by this luminous young woman. But behind closed doors, the marriage was already beginning to fracture. And that fracture, when it finally became public, would shake the monarchy to its core. Diana's unhappiness was not something she could hide forever. As the 1980s progressed, the cracks in her marriage became harder to conceal. She struggled with bulimia, an eating disorder driven by the immense pressure she felt, the constant scrutiny, the loneliness of her position. She experienced profound mental health struggles, periods of deep depression, even suicidal ideation. She needed help, but the palace, focused on maintaining appearances, offered little support. Diana felt trapped, isolated within the very institution that had promised her a fairy tale. Throughout the 1980s, the palace worked hard to conceal the true state of the marriage. Official photographs showed the couple smiling together, attending events, raising their two sons, William and Harry. But privately, both Charles and Diana were miserable. Charles continued his relationship with Camilla. Diana, desperate and increasingly resentful, began her own affairs. The marriage became a cold war, each side nursing grievances, neither willing to give the other what they needed. In 1992, everything changed. A journalist named Andrew Morton published a book titled Diana, Her True Story. It was explosive. The book detailed Diana's bulimia, her suicide attempts, Charles's affair with Camilla, the coldness of the royal family. It painted a portrait of a woman trapped and tormented. The palace initially dismissed the book as sensationalist fiction, but it quickly became clear that Diana herself had cooperated with Morton, providing information through an intermediary. She had broken the cardinal rule. She had gone public with the truth. The floodgates opened. Later that year, the Squidgygate tapes emerged. These were recordings of intimate phone conversations between Diana and a close friend, James Gilby, recorded years earlier. The press published transcripts, revealing Diana's frustration with the royal family, her loneliness, her desire to escape. It was humiliating for everyone involved, but it also humanized Diana in a way the palace had never allowed. She wasn't a perfect princess. She was a struggling, vulnerable human being. Then came Camillagate, or Tampongate, an even more scandalous set of recordings. These captured an intimate, sexually explicit conversation between Charles and Camilla. The details were mortifying. Charles, the future king and supreme governor of the Church of England, was caught on tape expressing his desire to be Camilla's tampon. The publication of these tapes destroyed any remaining pretense. The public now knew beyond doubt that Charles had been unfaithful, that his marriage to Diana was a sham. In 1994, Charles gave a televised interview to Jonathan Dimbleby. In it, he admitted to adultery, though he claimed it only occurred after the marriage had irretrievably broken down. It was a stunning confession, a future king publicly acknowledging infidelity. The palace's strategy seemed to be to get ahead of the narrative, to frame Charles as a man trapped in a loveless marriage, driven to seek comfort elsewhere. But it didn't work. The public sympathy remained overwhelmingly with Diana. Diana, emboldened, decided to tell her own story. In 1995, she sat down for an interview with the BBC's Panorama programme. It was watched by millions. Diana spoke candidly about her struggles, her bulimia, her affairs, and most famously, she said that there were 3 people in her marriage, so it was a bit crowded. She questioned whether Charles was suited to be king. She expressed her desire to be a queen in people's hearts. It was a devastating performance, both vulnerable and calculated. Diana had fully seized control of the narrative, and the palace was powerless to stop her. Years later, it emerged that the journalist who conducted that interview, Martin Bashir, had used forged documents to gain Diana's trust, fabricating bank statements to suggest that people close to her were being paid to spy on her. The BBC would eventually apologize for the deception, but at the time, the interview was seen as Diana's triumph, her chance to tell the truth without palace handlers spinning the message. The damage to the monarchy was immense. The fairy tale was dead, replaced by a bitter public dissolution. In 1996, Charles and Diana divorced. It was a relief for both of them, but it also marked a failure, a public acknowledgement that the institution's most celebrated union had been a disaster. In the aftermath, there were allegations of palace briefings against Diana, of attempts to diminish her in the press, to frame her as unstable or difficult. Diana believed the palace was working against her, trying to control the narrative even as she fought to tell her own story. Whether these briefings were as systematic as she believed remains contested, but the trust between Diana and the institution she had married into was utterly destroyed. She was free of the marriage, but she would never be free of the monarchy's shadow. And that shadow, as events would soon prove, could be a dark and dangerous place. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris. She had been fleeing from paparazzi, photographers on motorcycles, who chased her car through the city streets. The vehicle, driven at high speed by a chauffeur later found to have been drinking, crashed into a pillar. Diana was critically injured and died a few hours later in a Paris hospital. The world stopped. The news spread like wildfire. People everywhere, many of whom had never met Diana, felt a profound sense of loss. Immediately, questions arose. Who was to blame? The paparazzi? The media's insatiable appetite for images of Diana? The driver? Or something more sinister? Conspiracy theories began almost at once. Diana had been so at odds with the establishment. She had been dating Dodi Fayed, the son of Mohammed Al Fayed, an Egyptian billionaire who had long been denied British establishment acceptance. Some whispered that the crash was no accident, that dark forces within the British establishment, perhaps even intelligence services, had orchestrated her death to prevent her from marrying Dodi, from becoming stepmother to the future king, while linked to a non-British Muslim family. These theories were fueled by the royal family's response in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death. The Queen was at Balmoral in Scotland with William and Harry when the news arrived. She remained there, following protocol that dictated royal mourning be conducted in private. But the public wanted public grief. They wanted to see the Queen, to see the royal family share in the nation's sorrow. For days, the palace said nothing. No flags flew at half-mast over Buckingham Palace. There was no statement, no acknowledgement of the tidal wave of grief washing over Britain. The public's mood turned angry. How could the royal family be so cold, so distant, at a moment like this? Diana had been one of them, the mother of the future king. The streets around Kensington Palace were filled with flowers, messages, mourners weeping openly. But the palace remained silent, adhering to old rules that suddenly seemed heartless and out of touch. It was the lowest moment in the modern monarchy's history, a crisis of legitimacy and public trust. Finally, 5 days after Diana's death, the Queen returned to London. She gave a televised address, speaking as a grandmother and as Queen, acknowledging the nation's grief and paying tribute to Diana. The flag at Buckingham Palace was lowered to half-mast, breaking with tradition. The royal family participated in Diana's funeral, a public ceremony watched by billions around the world. It was enough to begin mending the rift, but the damage had been done. The monarchy's instinct for protocol and restraint had clashed catastrophically with the public's need for emotional connection. Diana's death had exposed the institution's vulnerability, its inability to adapt quickly to a changing world. The conspiracy theories persisted. Mohammed Al-Fayed was convinced his son and Diana had been murdered. He pushed for investigations, for inquests. In 2007, a lengthy inquest was held, examining every aspect of the crash. Witnesses testified. Experts analyzed evidence. The conclusion was that Diana and Dodi had been unlawfully killed, victims of the grossly negligent driving of the chauffeur and the pursuing paparazzi. There was no evidence of a murder plot, no smoking gun pointing to the establishment. But for many, the verdict was unsatisfying. The distrust lingered, fed by the years of palace secrecy, the sense that the full truth was always being kept just out of reach. In the years since, limited information has emerged about security failures surrounding Diana that night, about decisions made that might have prevented the tragedy. But documents detailing the palace's handling of Diana's death, its internal deliberations and communications, remain restricted. The framing of Diana as a victim of the institution, of a system that never truly accepted her, and that may have, through negligence or malice, contributed to her death, persists in popular imagination. Whether fair or not, it is a narrative the palace has struggled to overcome. Diana's death was a turning point, a moment when the monarchy's old methods of control and concealment failed spectacularly, leaving a wound that has never fully healed. In the aftermath of Diana's death, the royal family understood that it needed to change. The old compact with the press, the genteel self-censorship, was gone. The tabloids were voracious, and the public's appetite for royal scandal seemed bottomless. The palace adapted by professionalizing its communications operation. Skilled press officers, media strategists, lawyers, all were deployed to manage the royal image, to shape stories, to protect the institution from the kind of exposure Diana had represented. The motto had always been, never complain, never explain, a directive to maintain dignity and silence in the face of criticism. But behind the scenes, the palace became far more active. Legal threats were used to deter publication of damaging stories. Injunctions, super injunctions, court orders, all the tools of modern media law were employed to keep certain information out of the public eye. When stories did emerge, palace communications teams worked to spin them, to provide counter-narratives, to mitigate damage. But this professionalization also brought its own problems. There was growing recognition, even within the palace, of internal dysfunction. Different royal households, each serving a senior member of the family, sometimes worked at cross purposes. Rivalries, jealousies, and competing agendas created a fractured communication strategy. Stories leaked, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally. The image machine, for all its sophistication, was not always as coherent or effective as it appeared from the outside. The facade of control was just that, a facade. Beneath it, the same human frailties, the same institutional weaknesses persisted. Diana was not the only royal whose personal scandals tested the institution. Sarah Ferguson, who married Prince Andrew, the Queen's second son, in 1986, began with an early positive image. She was lively, approachable, a breath of fresh air. The press nicknamed her Fergie and celebrated her informality. But the marriage, like so many royal marriages, soured. Andrew's naval career kept him away from home. Sarah felt neglected, isolated. She began to attract negative coverage for her partying, her extravagance, her perceived lack of decorum. In 1992, the same year as Andrew Morton's book about Diana, photographs of Sarah were published that caused a sensation. The images showed her topless, having her toes sucked by John Bryan, an American financial advisor, while on holiday in the south of France. The photographs were humiliating. The royal family was appalled. Sarah's reputation never recovered. She and Andrew separated that year and eventually divorced. But unlike Diana, who maintained her popularity and found a role outside the palace, Sarah struggled. She faced financial chaos post-divorce, accumulating debts, engaging in ventures that often seemed desperate or undignified. In 2010, Sarah was caught in a tabloid sting. An undercover reporter posed as a businessman seeking access to Prince Andrew, who was at the time serving as a trade envoy. Sarah, believing she was negotiating a legitimate business deal, was recorded agreeing to arrange access to Andrew in exchange for £500,000. It was a cash-for-access scandal, and the public was outraged. Here was a member of the extended royal family, living in a grace and favour home, benefiting from her connection to the palace, trying to monetize access to a working royal. Sarah apologized, calling it a terrible, terrible error in judgment. But the damage was done. She became a symbol of the hangers-on, those who exploited their royal connections for personal gain. Prince Harry, Diana's younger son, grew up in the shadow of his mother's death. He was only 12 when she died, and the trauma marked him deeply. As he entered adulthood, Harry struggled to find his place. He had the title, the privilege, but also the suffocating scrutiny, the sense that he was the spare to William's heir, less important, less protected. His teenage years and early 20s were marked by scandals that seemed to confirm his status as the royal family's wild child. In 2005, Harry attended a friend's costume party dressed in a Nazi uniform, complete with a swastika armband. Photographs were published, and the backlash was immediate and fierce. How could a member of the British royal family, whose own great-uncle had fought against the Nazis, be so thoughtless, so offensive? Harry issued an apology, but the incident reinforced a narrative of immaturity and poor judgment. There were also reports of drinking and drug use, of Harry as a young man out of control, partying too hard, making bad choices. In 2012, photographs emerged from Las Vegas showing Harry naked at a private party. The images, taken during a game of strip billiards, were published by American media outlets. British newspapers held back, citing privacy concerns, but the story dominated headlines. It was another embarrassment, another reminder that Harry was struggling with the pressures of his position. The palace tried to move past it, emphasizing Harry's military service, his charity work, his efforts to honor his mother's legacy. Harry himself seemed to mature, becoming more serious about his role. But beneath the surface, Harry was becoming increasingly aware of the darker side of royal life, the relentless media intrusion, the lack of privacy, the sense that his every move was being watched and judged, and he was learning about something even more troubling. For years, British tabloids had been engaged in widespread phone hacking, illegally accessing the voicemails of public figures, including members of the royal family. Harry and his brother William were among the victims. Their staff had also been targeted. The scale of the intrusion was staggering. When the phone hacking scandal finally broke open, multiple newspapers were implicated. Investigations were launched. Settlements were reached with victims. Court cases dragged on for years. Harry became one of the most vocal critics of the tabloid press, pursuing legal action, testifying in court, refusing to let the matter drop. He saw the phone hacking as emblematic of a corrupt relationship between the media, the police, and powerful institutions, all enabled by a culture that treated royals as fair game for any kind of intrusion. His willingness to fight, to use the courts, set him apart from other royals, who typically preferred to settle quietly and move on. In 2016, Harry met Meghan Markle, an American actress. Their relationship moved quickly, and in November 2017, they announced their engagement. Meghan was beautiful, intelligent, accomplished, and biracial. Her inclusion into the royal family was celebrated by many as a sign of modernity, a step toward greater diversity. But from the beginning, Meghan faced scrutiny of a kind that felt different, more visceral, more personal. British tabloids delved into every aspect of her past, her family, her previous marriage. The coverage often had racist undertones, emphasizing her American-ness, her Hollywood background, her mixed-race heritage. Meghan's father, Thomas Markle, became a tabloid fixation. He was caught staging paparazzi photographs, a scandal that unfolded just days before the wedding. Meghan was devastated. The palace announced that Thomas would not attend the wedding due to health issues, but the damage was done. The media narrative shifted to Meghan as a woman whose own family was a liability, whose past was chaotic. It was brutal and relentless. The wedding in May 2018 was a global event, watched by millions. It was a beautiful ceremony, blending British tradition with African American culture, a celebration of diversity. But behind the scenes, tensions were already building. Meghan found the palace environment stifling. There were strict protocols, restrictions on what she could say or do. She felt unsupported, particularly in the face of the relentless media attacks. The palace, she believed, was unwilling to defend her, preferring to let negative stories run rather than risk drawing more attention. Stories began to emerge about tensions between Meghan and other members of the royal family, particularly Kate, the Duchess of Cambridge. There were reports of a rift between the two women, of Meghan making Kate cry, or perhaps the reverse. The details were unclear, often contradictory, but the narrative took hold. Meghan was difficult, demanding, a disruptive force within the palace. Some of these stories came from palace insiders, leaks, and briefings that seemed designed to paint Meghan in a negative light. The internal negative briefings, whether official or not, suggested a palace machine at work, managing the narrative by feeding certain stories to the press. In early 2020, Harry and Meghan made a dramatic announcement. They would be stepping back as senior royals, seeking to become financially independent, splitting their time between the UK and North America. The media dubbed it Megxit, framing it as a rejection of duty, a betrayal. But for Harry and Meghan, it was an act of self-preservation. They felt they had no choice. The pressure, the lack of support, the relentless media intrusion, it had all become unbearable. There were also disputes about security funding, about who would pay for their protection once they were no longer working royals. These disputes played out in the press, further souring the relationship between the Sussexes and the rest of the family. In March 2021, Harry and Meghan sat down for a televised interview with Oprah Winfrey. It was their chance to tell their side of the story, and they pulled no punches. Meghan revealed that she had experienced suicidal ideation during her time as a working royal, that she had asked for help and been refused. She spoke of feeling trapped and unsupported, and then she dropped a bombshell. She revealed that there had been conversations within the royal family about the potential skin color of her and Harry's son, Archie, before he was born. Someone had expressed concerns about how dark his skin might be. The accusation of racism within the royal family was explosive. It dominated headlines for weeks. The palace issued a brief statement saying the issues raised were concerning and would be addressed privately, but that recollections may vary. It was a carefully worded non-denial, an attempt to contain the damage without admitting fault. Harry also spoke about feeling let down by his father, Charles, and his brother, William, about a lack of support and understanding. He described a system that trapped everyone, including his family, in outdated roles and expectations. The interview also raised allegations of story trading between royal households. Harry suggested that different factions within the palace were leaking negative stories about each other to curry favor with the press, a toxic environment where members of the same family were undermining one another. It painted a picture of profound dysfunction, of an institution so focused on managing its image that it had lost sight of the people within it. The revelations were devastating, a level of exposure the palace had not experienced since Diana. And once again, the monarchy found itself on the defensive, struggling to contain a narrative that had spiraled beyond its control. While Harry and Meghan's departure dominated headlines, another scandal was quietly metastasizing, one that would prove even more damaging to the monarchy's reputation. Prince Andrew, the Queen's second son, had maintained a friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, a wealthy financier who was convicted in 2008 of soliciting prostitution from a minor. Epstein's crimes were far more extensive than that initial conviction suggested. He was a serial sexual predator, trafficking underage girls for himself and his powerful friends. And Andrew had been part of his social circle. Photographs existed showing Andrew with Epstein, even after Epstein's conviction. One photograph, taken in 2001, showed Andrew with his arm around Virginia Giuffre, then a teenager with Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's alleged accomplice, smiling in the background. Giuffre would later allege that she had been trafficked by Epstein and forced to have sex with Andrew on multiple occasions when she was 17. Andrew denied the allegations, but the image and Giuffre's testimony were deeply damaging. For years, Andrew and the palace attempted to manage the scandal with the old playbook. They issued denials. They avoided detailed comment. They hoped the story would fade, but it didn't. In 2019, Andrew agreed to a television interview with the BBC's Newsnight programme, believing he could clear his name. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Andrew's performance was widely seen as disastrous. He seemed evasive, entitled, and tone-deaf. He claimed he had been at the Pizza Express in Woking on one of the nights Giuffre alleged they had been together. He said he didn't remember meeting her, even though a photograph showed them together. He defended his friendship with Epstein, saying it had been convenient and that Epstein's behavior had been unbecoming. The public reaction was swift and brutal. Andrew was widely condemned. The interview did not exonerate him. It made things worse. Within days, the palace announced that Andrew would be stepping back from public duties. He was stripped of his royal patronages and military titles. He effectively became a non-person within the official royal structure, no longer representing the crown in any capacity. It was a stunning fall from grace. But even this was not enough for many critics. There were calls for Andrew to cooperate fully with American investigators looking into Epstein's network. Andrew's lawyers resisted, citing legal complexities. In 2022, Andrew reached a financial settlement with Virginia Giuffre, reportedly paying millions to resolve her civil lawsuit without admitting liability. The settlement allowed him to avoid a trial, but it did little to restore his reputation. The lack of transparency over investigations, over Andrew's finances, over how the palace had handled the allegations, all of it fed public cynicism. Here was a prince, accused of serious wrongdoing, protected by his status, shielded from full accountability. The scandal underscored the limits of the monarchy's ability to protect its own. Andrew had crossed a line, and the institution had no choice but to cut him loose, at least publicly. But the damage was done, the stain indelible. As we near the end of this long journey through secrets and scandals, it's worth stepping back to ask a fundamental question. How does the monarchy endure? After everything we've discussed, the betrayals, the cover-ups, the human frailties laid bare, why does this ancient institution persist? Part of the answer lies in the legal and structural protections that shield the monarchy from full scrutiny. The royal family is exempt from freedom of information laws. This means that while British citizens can request government documents and expect transparency, the same does not apply to the Queen or her household. The exemption is absolute for the sovereign and the heir to the throne. Communications, decisions, internal deliberations, all of it can remain hidden indefinitely. Even when documents are released, they are often heavily redacted, key passages blacked out to protect the dignity of the crown or national security. The sealing of royal wills continues. When senior royals die, their wills are locked away, never to be made public. This practice, which began in the early 20th century as we discussed, persists today. It means we don't know how royal wealth is distributed, what private arrangements were made, what secrets might be contained in those final documents. The justification is always the same: to avoid scandal, to protect the dignity of the crown. But the effect is to maintain a veil of secrecy around royal finances and private affairs. Royal wealth itself is opaque. The sovereign grant, which funds the official duties of the monarchy, is public. But private wealth, investments, offshore assets, these remain largely hidden. Estimates of the Queen's personal fortune vary wildly because there is no requirement for full disclosure. The Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall, private estates that generate income for the sovereign and the heir, operate with limited transparency. Profits are reported, but the details of holdings and investments are not fully disclosed. Behind-the-scenes lobbying by royals has also come to light, though only through court orders forcing disclosure. The Queen and Prince Charles have lobbied governments on legislation that affects their interests, using private channels to influence policy. These interventions were unknown to the public for years, revealed only when journalists pursued legal action to uncover them. The ability of unelected royals to shape laws that apply to everyone else raises profound democratic questions. Questions the palace would prefer remain unasked. There are allegations of modern press suppression, of palace efforts to control what gets published, to threaten legal action against outlets that dig too deep. The relationship between the palace and the media remains a complex dance, with both sides needing each other, but also deeply suspicious. The monarchy provides spectacle, sells newspapers, and generates clicks. The media provides publicity, keeps the royals relevant. But when the media threatens to expose too much, the palace pushes back, using every tool at its disposal. And then there are the ongoing mysteries, the current scandals that remain unresolved. Prince Andrew's expenses, how his lifestyle is funded now that he's no longer a working royal, remain largely secret. In 2024, there was the strange case of the missing princess, a period when Catherine, Princess of Wales, was absent from public view for months amid speculation about her health. When she finally reappeared, she released a video announcing she was being treated for cancer. But before that, the palace's handling of the situation was widely criticized. An official photograph released to quell rumors was later revealed to have been digitally altered, leading to accusations of manipulation and a loss of trust. These recent events are reminders that the patterns we've traced over more than a century persist. The instinct to control information, to manage the narrative, to reveal only what must be revealed, these remain central to how the monarchy operates. Scandal fades. Public attention moves on, but the structure remains, built on layers of secrecy, protected by law and tradition, resilient even in the face of its own failings. The monarchy survives not because it is perfect, but because it adapts, because it knows when to bend and when to hold firm. It survives because enough people still see value in it, whether as a symbol of continuity, a tourist attraction, or simply a familiar part of the national landscape. But it also survives because it has become expert at protecting itself, at keeping its deepest secrets, and ensuring that full transparency remains just out of reach. We've traveled together through more than a century of secrets, through moments of crisis and concealment, through lives lived in public and truths hidden in shadow. From the renaming of the royal house to obscure German roots, to the betrayal of the Romanovs, to Edward VIII's fascist sympathies, to the hidden lives of disabled royal cousins, to Diana's tragic arc, to Harry and Meghan's rupture, to Andrew's disgrace. We've seen a single thread running through it all. The institution survives by concealment. The British royal family is both spectacle and secret, an institution that thrives on visibility while jealously guarding its private truths. The scandals we've explored are not aberrations. They are windows into a system that has always prioritized its own survival above transparency, that has understood control of information as essential to maintaining power and legitimacy. From sealed wills to restricted archives, from careful press management to legal exemptions, the machinery of concealment is vast and sophisticated, yet secrets have a way of emerging. The most carefully guarded truths eventually find their way into light, whether through investigative journalism, court cases, or the words of those who feel wronged or trapped by the system. Diana broke the silence about her suffering. Harry has continued that tradition, refusing to accept the old rules about discretion and dignity. Each revelation chips away at the facade, making it harder for the institution to maintain the illusion of perfection. What does the future hold? The monarchy faces challenges that no amount of image management can fully address. Younger generations are less deferential, more skeptical of inherited privilege. The scandals keep coming. The contradictions between the institution's public role and its private behavior grow harder to ignore. And yet, the crown endures. It bends, it adapts, it absorbs scandal, and survives. Whether it can continue to do so in an age of unprecedented transparency and declining deference remains an open question. As you drift towards sleep, let these stories settle in your mind. They are not just tales of scandal and secrecy. They are stories about power, about how institutions protect themselves, about the human cost of duty and the price of truth. The British royal family is a mirror, reflecting both the grandeur and the failings of an entire system. A reminder that even the most exalted are deeply, irreducibly human. From the very beginning, survival depended not on honesty, but on control. That lesson, learned over a century ago, still guides the institution today, but control is becoming harder. The secrets are harder to keep. The public is less willing to look away. And so, the story continues, unfolding in real time. Each new revelation, another chapter in the long history of the crown and its secrets. Sleep well. And remember, behind every crown, there are stories that were never meant to be told.